Okay, good morning. I was asked and it's my pleasure, to highlight in very broad strokes um, some of the key contemporary cultural, racial, and ethnic issues pertinent to our adolescent and young adult population. I hope to provide a sense of the diversity of the population, some of which Claire has already sort of mentioned, and then delineate some key, though admittedly selected, cultural, racial, and ethnic processes specifically that I believe need to be a part of this broader conversation about young adults in the U.S. I'll conclude with some slides about how we might move this conversation forward. Adolescents and young adults in the U.S. are becoming a more ethnically and racially diverse group than ever before, as you've seen already. Ethnic racial minorities comprise over 40% of the population under the age of 18 and 40% of the population of young people aged specifically between the ages of 18 and 24. And these numbers are only poised to increase, as we know from the fact that over 50% of births in 2011 were to ethnic racial minority families. I'd like to note the particular role of Hispanics and Latinos in the changing young adult population. As you can see from this map and the next two, Hispanics and Latinos have contributed substantially to the significant changes in our overall population. Based on projections by the Census and the Pew Hispanic Research Center, a major cause of the shift in both the ethnic minority population generally, the general population as well, and the Hispanic population specifically, is immigration. Today's adolescents and young adults were born into a world that was becoming increasingly diverse as they were growing up, due in part to continued immigration. These maps illustrate, the next maps illustrate changes in the foreign-born population between 1990 and today, 1990 when a typical, a 22-year-old would have been born. As you will see in the next couple of slides, most of the country has become more diverse, as relatively few areas have not experienced a change in their foreign-born population. In other words, the country has become more diverse in more places, well outside the established areas of ethnic minority presence we may have thought of in the past, such as LA, New York City, the large cities, and the Southwest. Moving from demographics to processes, I suggest in this conversation that understanding today's adolescents and young adults means exploring two broad issues. One, what are young adults' experiences with this increasing diversification, to which they themselves are contributing and helping to shape? And two, what are communities' capacities to maximize the participation of these youth in education, labor, and political systems of this nation, and thus ensuring that our country actually benefits from its diversification. To begin this process, I think we need to ask ourselves, do we view as this increasing diversity as an opportunity or as a challenge? And we'll need to answer this question as we look toward the future. We know that based on December 2012 census projection, over the next several decades, we can expect the white population to decline while all other ethnic minority groups increase. Specifically, by 2060, minorities will increase from 37% to 57% of the population. And in just 30 years, the U.S. will actually become a majority-minority nation for the first time. That's in 2043. However, non-Hispanic whites will remain the largest single group, and no group will make up a majority. Thus, adolescents and young adults will ultimately live in a plurality that looks more and more like they do: white, Latino, Black, Asian, American Indian, and multiracial, among others. I would like to propose that we consider these challenges as both these changes as both an opportunity and a challenge. That is, the remarkable transformation our youth holds great potential for increasing these minorities' participation in and contribution to social, political, and economic well-being of this country. One path to fully realizing this potential is to explicate how the diversity matters in the experiences, relationships, contexts, and outcomes of this significant segment of the U.S. Paralleling these demographic shifts that you've seen now in several maps and charts, social scientists and psychologists as well have been, in this group, psychologists have been contributing, though not as much as sociologists, I think. But they've been interested in how our diverse youth, particularly those of immigrant heritage, fare in our society. There are several key aspects of youth adaptation that we've been interested in that will be particularly important as we move forward toward a comprehensive understanding of them, and then also how to serve them. This work will require multiple levels of analysis, as illustrated by Doe's just one model that illustrates how this will be a multi-level process. Working from the ground up, we need to understand how young people define themselves in terms of their ethnicity and race, which is constantly changing. At a basic level, this means just looking at classification. So how do they self-classify and identify? As we've seen with biracials and multiracials in the last decades. For instance, these self-identifications have important implications for how young people are counted, where they're counted, how they're counted. And then also psychological ones for how they experience race in a more fluid and flexible manner than previously thought. Perhaps more importantly, there's a burgeoning literature on ethnic and racial identity rather than identification that we ought to bring to bear on this conversation. That is, what are the sorts of meanings that young people ascribe to their membership in these groups? From these studies, we know that some of the most intriguing developments in youth's ethnic and racial identities are often made during late adolescence and young adulthood, precisely during the transition to adulthood. It's often a time when individuals re-examine, redefine, and consolidate their identities. At another level, we'll also need to continue to expand our knowledge of how diverse young adults experience interpersonal relationships with members of other groups and the intergroup interactions at a broader level. Extant literature suggests that under the right conditions, we can foster intercultural understanding, appreciation, respect, and collaboration. Finally, as many of you know, there are disparities, and have been mentioned by Richard Setterson, among others. There are disparities in the educational outcomes of several ethnic minorities and whites that foreshadow and continued bifurcation in the life trajectories of these groups. For instance, by 2050, 31% of the working age population, aged 18 to 64, will be Hispanic. But as we know, they're currently less likely to become highly educated, and thus they will collectively likely continue to be at an occupational and economic advantage in that future. In addition, we need to unpack how adults, young adults, experience ethnic or racial discrimination in education, work, and other settings, and tackle how best to reduce such processes of social exclusion. The best available evidence coming from the National Latino and Asian American Study and the National Survey of American Life suggests that Latinos aged 18 to 24, 50% of them, of this age group, specifically the group we're interested in, reported having experienced discrimination, and 87% of African American adolescents aged 13 to 17 had experienced racial discrimination. Smaller community-based studies, non-representative samples, provide similar statistics underscoring the prevalence of this social exclusion among diverse groups, not only among African Americans and Latinos, but also Asian Americans. To complement this work, we'll also need more studies that clarify, what are the kinds of experiences that signal to ethnic minorities. So not only, the problems of diversity and social exclusion, i.e. social exclusion, but also what are the kinds of signals that youth get about, that welcome and encourage their full participation in American society. In closing, that's not what I thought would happen. Let's go back. How do I go back? Okay, thank you. In closing, given the well-established, we're not closing just yet. In closing, given the well-established link between education and socioeconomic status more broadly, and other people will be talking about that in more depth during this workshop, with health outcomes, and the links between social marginalization experiences at the individual level with, health problems, things like discrimination that I've just touched on. We must continue, I think part of this conversation really needs to include an understanding of the processes pertaining to those, issues in young adulthood. Moreover, we should identify not only, some of the problems, but also what are some protective processes. And in my work and work by others, we've been looking at the role of ethnic and racial identities, so what young people believe about their group membership, and how these, and in turn, in some ways, it may buffer youth from these negative processes. So our diversifying population poses, I think we can all agree that it poses both an opportunity and a challenge. We need to reduce social marginalization that's often manifest in the educational and socioeconomic disparities that we hear a lot about. But we can also think about this alternatively as increasing social inclusion, systems of participation for these youth in order to build engaged, healthy, productive individuals and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I feel like keeping in time is probably a very good example of the self-regulating abilities of young adult that Larry and Bea were talking about. So you're really a symbol of positive youth development for us today. So our next speaker is Heidi Scherholz, who's going to be talking about the economy.